Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1749 of the series. We will today begin with a new article by David Egan, Pictures in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. A lot has been written about pictures and how they participate in the writings of Wittgenstein, and especially there are extensive mentionings of the Augustinian picture of the world, where an ostensive definition by pointing could clear out the relationship between a word and a thing in the world. Much less mentioning has been made about the picture that Wittgenstein is talking about. Picture that we get mesmerized by. The picture that captivates our thinking capacity. And makes it an obstacle that we cannot disclose easily. It is well hidden underneath it all. In the article of David Egan, a careful investigation is instigated in order to try to get under the skin. What is this picture Wittgenstein is talking about? And the goal of the article is to help the reader get at least a first grip of the picture theory and what could be the thing that captivates us. What is it that drags us into this definiteness of the picture? I begin a reading from the very first page of the article by David Egan. Introduction. The first sentence of the philosophical investigations that Wittgenstein gives us in his own voice identifies a particular picture of the essence of human language in a passage from Augustine's Confessions. While commentators had a great deal to say about the so-called Augustinian picture of language, remarkably little has been done to investigate the use of picture as it appears not just here but in many places throughout the investigations and elsewhere in Wittgenstein's later work. Philosophers often use picture as a kind of causal shorthand to give a rough sketch of a philosophical position or theoretical framework. However, Wittgenstein's use of the term is more deliberate and pervasive. The aim of this paper is to shed some light on Wittgenstein's distinctive methodology by scrutinizing his use of pictures as an important part of his critical apparatus. An initial worry might seem to risk preventing this discussion from even getting started. What reason we have to think that there is any unity to Wittgenstein's use of pictures at all? there are certainly good grounds for this worry. Wittgenstein clearly uses the term picture in a wide variety of contexts and with varying degrees of precision. A useful first step will be to draw up a rough classification of some of these uses. However, just because Wittgenstein does not use picture in a rigidly defined sense does not mean that we should not find something of philosophical significance in its deployment, any more than we should give up on drawing important lessons from Wittgenstein's use of language game. Just because he puts the term to a diversity of uses. What I hope will emerge from the ensuing discussion is a family of uses of the term picture, many of which are related in subtle ways, such that considering the whole can illuminate each instance. My survey will have to be selective. Much more can be said on this topic, and if this paper helps spur further work, it will have achieved one of its principal aims. To begin with, I will sketch a rough classification of the uses Wittgenstein makes of pictures in his later work. That classification will distinguish between the term used in a literal sense and in a more distinctively philosophical sense. I will consider Wittgenstein's use of literal pictures as a way of shedding light on what I think he is doing in using the term in this more philosophical sense. Before considering by way of conclusion how these pictures fit into Wittgenstein's broader philosophical project, two, a rough classification. First, then, a rough classification of the 5 uses of picture in Wittgenstein's later work. These 5 categories do not cover all the uses of picture, and many instances confound a rigid classification. These distinctions then serve as a preliminary survey and are not meant to bear much argumentative weight. One, literal pictures. Sometimes when Wittgenstein talks about pictures, he really just means pictures, the sort of things you can draw on a paper and that have lines and sometimes colors. There are numerous examples from amongst other philosophical investigations. In addition, we find pictures inserted throughout Wittgenstein's later work, which he uses in various ways. Two, mental pictures. Wittgenstein frequently tries to get a handle of problematic conceptions of the mental by conceiving of pictures in the head. Excuse me. A prominent moral here is that even though pictures may float before the mind on certain occasions, they cannot do the work Wittgenstein's interlocutor often hope they will do. Three, conceptual pictures. My main quarry in this paper is the kind of picture that cannot literally be drawn on a piece of paper. Wittgenstein often talks about our manner of conceiving something as a picture. He does so in many different ways. Here I give three prominent subcategories. A. Pseudo-thesis. The Augustinian picture is the most prominent case of a sentence or small number of sentences which seem to make a definite philosophical claim, but which Wittgenstein argues are empty or false. Sorting out whether and how they count as empty or false is a major concern of this paper. B. Illustrated terms of speech. Turns of phrase or forms of expressions that are not themselves philosophical claims, but which incline us to consider a matter in a particular way. Instances from philosophical investigations, Zettel and Wittgenstein's Nachlass, and where Wittgenstein explicitly equates a picture with a form of expression. C. Conceptions. Not necessarily thoughts that can be given verbal expression, either as pseudo-thesis or turns of speech, but ways of conceiving of a matter. These conceptions can be either of a quite particular matter, or they can be global in scope. In uncertainty, we find occasional reference to a world picture. While Wittgenstein's reasons for invoking pictures of types 1 and 2 may be difficult to discern, the use of picture in those instances is itself unproblematic. The varieties of type 3 present a further question. However, why call these pictures at all? Why not just talk about positions or conceptions or forms of expression? What does Wittgenstein accomplish in calling them pictures? I can offer both positive and negative reasons for talking about pictures in these instances, both of which I will explore in more detail shortly. The positive reason is that Wittgenstein wants to draw our attention to certain connections between pictures of type 3 and those of types 1 and 2. These connections are by no means straightforward or uniform, but the discussion that follows should draw out some prominent strands. The negative reason is that these pictures have a distinctive logical role for Wittgenstein that a term like position and even conception would fail to capture. Pictures of type 3, I will argue, are not definite positions or claims for which we can supply arguments or justifications, but neither are they wholly independent of the argumentative apparatus. Because they are not subject to affirmation or refutation in the way that substantive claims are. Engaging with them critically requires a novel set of critical tools. Part of the distinctiveness of Wittgenstein's later work is that it frequently constitutes this kind of novel engagement. Before delving into pictures of type 3, I want to explore three central strands in Wittgenstein's invocations of pictures of type 1 and 2, which will help us to make sense of Wittgenstein's aims in invoking pictures in the non-literal sense of type 3. The first strand concerns the application of a picture and how a picture cannot dictate its own application to us. The second considers Wittgenstein's interest in aspect perception and what that tells us about pictures. The third considers the role of pictures more broadly in terms of the roles they play in our lives and how we should not overgeneralize an overly simple conception of depiction. Picture and application. The first strand about the application of a picture closely follows Wittgenstein's more famous discussion of the application of rules. On the one hand, it seems a picture can always be applied in various ways. And on the other hand, we tend not to be in doubt as to how to apply the pictures we encounter. We find both of these thoughts in the second boxed remark between paragraph 139 and 140. I see a picture. It represents an old man walking up a steep path, leaning on a stick. How might it not have looked just the same if he had been sliding downhill in that position? Perhaps a Martian would describe the picture so. I do not need to explain why we do not describe it so. The picture on its own seems to open more than one interpretation, and Wittgenstein describes reading a picture in a particular way as an application of the picture or a method of projection. No further attempt to disambiguate the picture has any guarantee of succeeding, since any disambiguation is also open to more than one application. Suppose we were to draw an arrow pointing up the hill. Not only could we equally read that arrow as pointing back down the hill, but we need not read the arrow as signifying the direction of the man's movement at all. In cases of genuine doubt, instruction or interpretation can help clarify the application of a picture, but they can no more remove the possibility of ambiguity in an absolute sense than the picture itself. The point here is not that the picture is inescapably ambiguous, but that neither the picture itself nor further instruction or interpretation can irresistibly dictate the picture's application. That we, for the most part, apply the same picture similarly is not because we are under the compulsion of an ineluctably univocal rule that points from picture to application, but rather because we have a shared sense of what pictures are. What they tend to depict, how people communicate with them, and so on. The idea of climbing a mountain is familiar to us, as is using a stick to help in the climb, as is the human practice of depicting such scenes from human life. Sliding backwards down a hill while holding a stick is alien to us, and so it takes an effort to see the picture in this way. Wittgenstein's Martian might not apply the picture similarly because it might not share with us the basic forms of life that are the basis for our agreement about how a picture is applied. This point becomes crucial when Wittgenstein considers the notion of mental pictures and their connection to meaning and understanding. Could my understanding of a word be connected to a mental picture of the meaning of that word, so that the criterion for my having understood, is the right picture is that the right picture comes before my mind. One problem with this view is that it assumes the picture in my mind can dictate its own application. Wittgenstein elsewhere describes such a picture as a superpicture. With a picture, it still depends on the method of projection, whereas here it seems that you get rid of the projecting relation and are absolutely certain that this is the thought of that. Mental pictures can be as clear and unambiguous as the pictures that we encounter outside our heads, but no more. The aspiration for a superpicture is not just that it be clear enough for all practical purposes, but that it be superlatively clear with no room for doubt or variance. At philosophical investigation, (139) Wittgenstein asks how a mental picture of a cube might reflect an understanding of the word cube. Cubes are prisms, so a picture of a cube is equally a picture of a prism. The same picture could equally well be projected so that it connects with the word prism. At best, Wittgenstein says, the picture of a cube did suggest a certain use to us, suggest that we associate the word cube, but it was also possible for me to use it differently. Put a little pause there. continue the trodden path, for the picture not only to suggest a particular use, but to compel it. We want the picture to contain instructions for its own application. But any such instructions must be applied along with a picture that contains them. So they cannot be the link that joins the picture to its application. The attraction to pictures in the mental realm is the thought that they might serve as super pictures. But what is true for pictures on paper is equally true for mental pictures. Isn't it obvious here that it is absolutely inessential that this picture be in his imagination rather than in front of him as a drawing or model, or again as something that he himself construct as a model. The mental cannot magically supply a super connection between picture and application that cannot exist outside the head. Wittgenstein's concerned that we not construe pictures as super pictures is not that we might apply the picture wrongly. Seeing the old man on the stick as climbing the hill, when we should see him as sliding down backwards. But that we might expect pictures to be able to do more work for us than they do. Applying a picture is a human practice embedded in human forms of life. So what a picture tells us cannot be independent of these forms of life. Treating a picture as a super picture whose application comes of its own accord makes us neglect the often important and revealing question of how and why we apply pictures in the way we do, in the way that we do. These observations about pictures tie into some of Wittgenstein's methodological concerns. In philosophy, more generally, Wittgenstein finds that we often allow our way of conceiving of a matter to dictate to us the sorts of questions we should ask and the lines of investigation we should pursue. When in fact the interesting philosophical work lies in exploring our way of conceiving of the matter in the first place. In the first place, our language describes a picture. What is to be done with a picture, how it is to be used, is still obscure. Quite clearly, however, it must be explored if we want to understand the sense of our words. But the picture seems to spare us this work. It already points to a particular use. This is how it takes us in. Similarly, in philosophical investigations, paragraphs 422 to 427, Wittgenstein repeatedly urges us to consider the application of pictures that seem innocuous to us. Like with the mental pictures discussed above, conceptual pictures seem to spare us work, but in fact they can lead us to skip the step in our thinking that is most crucial. This is how philosophers should salute each other, Take your time. Wittgenstein becomes keenly interested in the phenomenon of aspect perception in his post-investigations writings on the philosophy of psychology. The paradigmatic example is the duck rabbit. When we change aspect from seeing a picture duck to a picture rabbit, nothing has changed, yet everything has changed. What changes is nothing in the picture itself, nor in anything that could coherently be described as our visual impression of the picture. Rather, what changes is our overall way of relating to the picture, making sense of it. Wittgenstein here occasionally speaks of the physiognomy of an aspect of a picture. As if a picture does not merely represent, but also express character and motion and emotion. Two aspects of a picture are mutually exclusive. We cannot simultaneously see the duck rabbit as a duck and as a rabbit. Someone who's not aware of the duck aspect of the duck rabbit will relate to that picture just as she would relate to a picture of a rabbit. If she sees the duck rabbit surrounded by other pictures, she would be inclined to see it as a picture rabbit. One way of shifting the aspect would be to remove the duck rabbit from this context and to surround it instead with pictures of ducks. once he becomes aware of the other aspect, she can shift between the two aspects at will, even though she cannot consider them both at the same time. As we will see shortly, Gordon Baker finds an important analogy between these observations about pictures and the sorts of philosophical pictures that are the main concern of this paper. In his view, Wittgenstein's aim is to present us with objects of comparison that shift the aspect with which we view a matter, allowing us to see a contingent and changeable what we had previously taken for fixed and necessary. For Baker, Wittgenstein's discussion of aspect perception provides a potent allegory for his philosophical method. Non-representational pictures. So far, the operative question has been what the picture represents. The duck rabbit could represent a duck or a rabbit. The picture of the old man on the stick could be read as representing an uphill climb or a downward slide. The broader point to consider with pictures is not only that they can be taken to represent different things, but that pictures have roles far beyond those that such talk of representation might most immediately bring to mind. The ways we apply pictures are diverse. We use them as instructions, as advertisement. We amuse ourselves with cartoons and enrich ourselves in museums. We use them as evidence, as reminders, as forget-me-nots, as supplements to stories, or as stories on their own, and so on. Which is to say that they play various roles in what Wittgenstein occasionally calls our forms of life. That we can interact with pictures in the way that we do depends on our having these forms of life. We are used to pictures and photographs representing people, not to scale, and even without color. And we are familiar with the practice of keeping small photographs of loved ones in our wallets. Someone unfamiliar with these practices, but familiar with a race of miniature humans, might instead see a wallet-sized photo as a representation of a tiny person rather than a shrunken down version of a regular human. That we see a wallet-sized photograph as representing this person depends on our having these forms of life and operating smoothly with them. These considerations are hardly divorced from what has come before. In his discussion of aspect perception, we saw that Wittgenstein talks about the physiognomy of a picture and is well attuned to the various roles a picture might play. Stephen Mulhall argues that Wittgenstein's discussion of aspect perception is not ultimately an exploration of peculiar cases like the duck rabbit, but rather of the universal phenomenon of continuous aspect perception. We relate to pictures as we relate to things in the world in terms of the flesh-out living significance they take on in the relations with other aspects of our lives. In the lectures of religious belief, Wittgenstein uses the example of Michelangelo's depiction of God creating Adam. Making sense of such a picture is not just a matter of getting the method of projection right, in the sense of God reaching out and touching Adam, rather than the other way around. We also need to understand that this picture is meant allegorically and not as an accurate representation of a historical event. If we ever saw this in real life, we certainly wouldn't think this the deity. The picture has to be used in an entirely different way if we are to call the man in the queer blanket God, and so on. Furthermore, Michelangelo's depiction is not some sort of second best alternative, as if he were showing us an allegory rather than what actually happened. For many intents and purposes, Michelangelo's picture is as good a picture of God creating Adam as we could hope for. The depiction does not fall short of the facts. It just depicts in a manner that is different from, for instance, a historical painting. We find a similar point in PI paragraph 368. I describe a room to someone and then get him to paint an impressionistic picture from this description to show that he has understood it. Now he paints the chairs, which I described as green, dark red, where I said yellow, he paints blue. This is the impression which he got of that room, and now I say, quite right, that's what it looks like. I take it that the quite right suggests that this picture does not have a metaphorical relationship to the description of the room, so that we can translate from the impressionistic picture back to the description without losing anything. The impressionistic picture shows us something about the room that is irreducible to a more literal description. And indeed, pictures often work in this way, whether and how they represent is a complicated matter. These observations stand as a warning against taking philosophical pictures as straightforwardly or exclusively representational. The forms of expressions included in type 3b are often perfectly innocent. Is it wrong to say, for instance, an idea came into my head? But making sense of the role that they play is often a very complex affair. Misconstruing this role as more or less descriptive of actual states and processes often leads to the blossoming of philosophical theories to explain how these states and processes work. These remarks about how pictures have roles that extend beyond a limited conception of representation correspond to Wittgenstein's remarks that language games have roles that extend beyond the descriptive. Four, philosophical pictures. I sketched three varieties of conceptual pictures under type 3 above, which have obvious differences but also important similarities. As Wittgenstein uses them, these pictures can be simple turns of speech that do not necessarily have any philosophical motive. As in 3b, they can explicitly serve as the basis upon which philosophical theorizing begins. Or they may sit somewhere in between, as 3c. In all three cases, the pictures are something that lie deep within us and seem to come before deliberate reflection. The things that Wittgenstein calls pictures tend to be the basis for reflection rather than the result of reflection. His concern with them is that they frequently escape critical notice because they lie so deep and do not simply shape the answers we give to philosophical questions. But are the source of the confusions that give rise to the questions in the first place. How are we to make sense of these pictures within the context of Wittgenstein's work, and how our understanding of his work might need to shift in order to accommodate his talk of pictures, is far from clear and has not received a great deal of attention in secondary literature. One of the main, although not the only, commentators to draw significantly on pictures is Gordon Baker, and I will begin by reviewing his reading before drawing on the lectures of religious belief to provide my own alternative. Baker's pictures. In the 1990s, Gordon Baker began developing a novel way of reading Wittgenstein that draws significantly on the notion that pictures do not themselves give us false claims to refute, but are rather pre-theoretical frameworks that often lack perspicuity. Baker treats pictures as forms or norms of representation that operate not at the first order level of depicting regions of our grammar, but at the second level of depicting how we conceive of the structure of our grammar. These pictures are not in themselves descriptive, and so neither describe nor misdescribe anything. Being caught in a picture is a matter of mistaking the picture for an accurate first-order description of grammar, and so not allowing for alternatives. Wittgenstein uses pictures, Baker claims, as objects of comparison by presenting us with an alternative picture. Wittgenstein is not trying to give us a more accurate depiction of anything, but is trying rather to shift the aspect under which we conceive of a matter, and so to free us from the feeling of necessity that we can attach to certain pictures. We see similar arguments to the effect that pictures are objects of comparison, and that Wittgenstein's aim is to free us from the grip of certain pictures have us in. One immediate advantage of this reading is that it helps us to cash out the significance of using pictures to describe the various items classified under type 3. Contrasts Baker's reading to that of Eugene Fisher, who treats pictures as paradigms or thought schemas that philosophers take to be representative of a wider range of cases and to which they accord a significance that they would otherwise not have. Fisher's analysis suggests that pictures are essentially unexamined assumptions and are problematic by virtue of leading to unwarranted generalizations. On its own, Fisher claims, a picture may be an innocent truism, and indeed could be a useful object of comparison for heuristic purposes. But the tendency to apply this truism more broadly than is warranted may lead us to make substantive claims whose rootedness in this paradigm makes them seem intuitively compelling and thus leaves them unquestioned. On this analysis, then, bad philosophical pictures differ from false propositions only in being held implicitly and more deeply. In contrast, Baker's reading makes pictures out to be of a different kind from propositions or assumptions, and treating them requires a different methodology and a vocabulary. Hence, picture instead of assumption. Than that they're employed in a more traditional forms of criticism. However, reading Wittgenstein as is interested in no more than shifting aspects in order to release the grip that pictures have on us, has two features that strike me as problematic. The first is that Wittgenstein does not simply talk about pictures in terms of the hold they have on us, but quite plainly talks about pictures being bad and even false. Baker is not blind to the fact that Wittgenstein often takes pictures themselves to be a problem. A picture may be both empty and pernicious. This seeming paradox is fundamental to Wittgenstein's conception of pictures. How Baker himself resolves this seeming paradox is less than clear. However, his most immediate evidence for calling a picture pernicious is Wittgenstein's description of the Augustinian picture of language as surrounding the working of language with a haze which makes clear vision impossible. A picture might perniciously obscure our vision and yet still be empty or content, but it is hard to see how it can be both empty and false. Furthermore, if Wittgenstein's sole aim with pictures is to release the grip they have on us, an attribution that might not stick to Baker quite so simply, but Hutchinson and Reed seem quite committed to this view. That is, if this were so, the sole measure of the perniciousness of a picture would seem to be the strength of the grip it has on us. This view leads to some bizarre results. Is the human body the best picture of the human soul? only in the sense that this picture has less of a grip on us than other pictures. Surely, Wittgenstein does not simply want to free us from the grip of pictures, but also wants to show us how some pictures are less susceptible to misapplication than others, that some indeed come closer to the truth of things than others. I will argue in more detail shortly. I think the empty and pernicious view arises from a false dichotomy. Either pictures have some sort of propositional content or they are empty. I think Baker is right to claim that pictures do not have propositional content in any straightforward sense, nor even in the sense of representing unspoken but definite assumptions, as on Fisher's view, but wrong to think that pictures must therefore be described as empty. The second problematic feature of Baker's reading is that he is unclear what exactly he means by the aspect of a picture in this conceptual sense. Wittgenstein's discussion of aspect shifting deals with apparent applications of the same picture. The lines that make up the duck rabbit are the same with the picture duck and the picture rabbit. What shifts is our application of the picture. The conceptual analog would be to apply the same picture in different ways. To take the claim that a man has a soul, for instance, to be a theological truth, or as an expression of the attitude we take towards others as living beings rather than automata. But Baker's signal example of a shift in aspect is a shift from the Augustinian picture of language to the picture that meaning is use. Is Wittgenstein shifting the aspect of the same picture here? Or is he offering us an alternative picture? Baker's work seems ambiguous at this point. This criticism raises some difficulties for Baker's reading, difficulties I aim to address in due course, but it is far from withering. In particular, I think Baker is right to see pictures as distinct from deeply held assumptions or unexamined beliefs, thinking that what a picture tells us is perfectly clear is to make the same mistake as thinking that a picture ineluctably dictates its application to us. Nor is it as innocent as thinking that the picture of an old man on the stick is perfectly clear. The sorts of pictures that motivate philosophical reflection or confusion are not straightforward depictions of facts, but are closer to Michelangelo's depiction of God creating Adam. The picture is immediately compelling, but cashing out its significance is a matter fraught with difficulty. Understanding a philosophical picture is a difficult work, and accepting or rejecting a picture is not simply a matter of persuasion. Pictures take hold of us at a level deeper than reasoned acceptance or rejection, and in this way the experience is less one of persuasion and more of conversion. No surprise then that pictures feature so prominently in Wittgenstein's discussion on religious beliefs. So what we went through here is to look at pictures as captivating us, but rather, what are these pictures? And how do they get a hold on us? I'd say the next chapter here is religious pictures. And I'd say it's beyond belief I think it's beyond belief that underneath religion there is, well, underneath society as whole, there is a very persistent, forceful depiction, a picture that has drawn us to abandoning religion and belief. I'm very sure of that's the case. I'm not implying that the picture is wrong. I'm not implying that it can completely be, so to speak, revealed. But it must be a picture because the conviction is that strong. It goes beyond argument and words. It's pretty convincing. And in my view, my take on it, only pictures can be that convincing because they are closer to experience and they cannot be questioned by words. They may be enforced by words or create words and arguments, but they are the a priori, so to speak. And we humans make up laws in the idea that they rule the whole thing. I think that's absolutely wrong. It's very promising, and many new names here like Baker, Hutchinson and Reed. And of course, Stephen Mulhall sounds very interesting as well. On being in the world, Wittgenstein and Heidegger on seeing aspects. It sounds very interesting. And, oh, what happened here? Okay, I say thank you very much for participating, listening in this promising or interesting article that leads to other authors as well. David Egan seems to be very good to gather them all. It's important, I'd say. Have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Bye bye for now.